The baby had stopped crying. That was the worst part. Not the snow piling against the cabin door, not the empty cupboards, not even the 3 days of sleepless hell since Martha had bled out on the birthing bed. It was the silence. Ethan Cole pressed his cracked lips to his son's cold forehead and felt the tiny chest barely rise. The infant's skin had gone gray, lips tinged blue, eyes sunken. 3 days without milk. 3 days of watching death creep closer while the good people of Ridgway, Colorado turned their backs and bolted their doors. If you want to see how one man's desperate love defied an entire town's cruelty, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind screamed through the pines like something wild and dying. Ethan Cole stood in the center of Ridgway's frozen main street, his son wrapped in a threadbare quilt against his chest, and understood with perfect clarity that no one was coming to help. He'd spent the last 3 hours moving door to door, the mercantile, the boarding house, the homes of families he'd known since childhood. Every single one had listened to his plea, a newborn starving, a wife dead, a man broken, and every single one had found a reason to turn away. Mrs. Henshaw had looked at the baby with something like pity before shaking her head. "I've got 3 of my own to feed, Ethan. Can't spare what I don't have." Her door closed with a soft, final click. Thomas Wardell, who'd borrowed Ethan's plow last spring, had been blunter. "Should have thought about that before you took up with a woman whose own family wouldn't claim her." The implication hung ugly in the air. Martha had been trouble, and now Ethan was paying the price for loving her. At the doctor's office, old Doc Brennan had refused to even open the door. "Bring the child to the church," he'd called through the wood. "Let the pastor's wife handle it." But Ethan had already tried the church. Pastor Michaels had offered prayers and platitudes, but no milk, no wet nurse, no practical help whatsoever. Now, as afternoon bled into evening and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, Ethan stood alone in the gathering dark. The baby hadn't moved in over an hour. His tiny fists were unclenched, his breathing so shallow it barely fogged the air between them. "Please," Ethan whispered into the wind. "Somebody." The street remained empty. Lamplight flickered behind curtained windows. Somewhere a dog barked. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, and snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that stuck to Ethan's coat and hair. He'd lost everything. The ranch, barely more than 20 acres of rough grazing land, was mortgaged to the teeth. Martha's medical bills had taken what little savings they'd scraped together. The livestock had been sold off one by one just to keep food on the table through the autumn. And now Martha herself was gone, buried yesterday in frozen ground, while Ethan had stood hollow-eyed and broken, holding a son who was following her into the grave. "Mr. Cole?" The voice was young, tentative. Ethan turned to find Henry Dobbs, the postal clerk's apprentice, hovering near the corner of the mercantile. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, all elbows and earnest eyes beneath a cap dusted with snow. "Henry," Ethan's voice came out raw. "You know anyone at all, who might help?" Henry glanced over his shoulder, nervous. "Most folks, they've made up their minds about you, sir, after what happened with your wife." "What happened with my wife," Ethan said slowly, "was that she died bringing our son into this world." "Is that a crime now?" "No, sir. But folks remember that her family disowned her. They remember she came here with nothing and no references. They say—" He stopped, looking miserable. "They say what?" "That she must have done something shameful, otherwise why would her own blood turn her out?" Henry shifted his weight, hugging himself against the cold. "It ain't right, Mr. Cole, but that's what they say." Ethan closed his eyes. Martha had never spoken about her past, and he'd loved her enough not to press. She'd appeared in Ridgway 2 years ago with a battered carpetbag and eyes that held old sorrow. She'd worked as a seamstress, kept to herself, and when Ethan had stumbled into her orbit, clumsy and smitten, she'd smiled at him like he was something unexpected and good. They'd married quietly. She'd made their drafty cabin into something that felt like home, and now she was gone, and the town's judgment had outlived her. "There's no one then," Ethan said quietly. Henry bit his lip. Then in a rush, "There might be someone, but you won't like it. I'll take anyone." Lydia Hart. The name dropped between them like a stone into still water. Ethan stiffened. The widow? Yes, sir. Henry's words came faster now, as if afraid he'd lose his nerve. She lost her own baby, about 3 months back, and her husband before that. She's got milk still, I think. I've seen her buying things at the store, baby things, even though there's no baby anymore. Mrs. Pruitt says it's unnatural, but maybe... He trailed off, hopeful and uncertain. Lydia Hart. Ethan knew the stories, everyone did. She lived alone at the edge of town in a house with a blue door, and people crossed the street rather than walk past it. Her husband had died in a logging accident 2 years ago. She'd been pregnant when it happened, carried the baby to term alone, and then the infant had died. Some said at birth, some said days after. No one knew for certain because Lydia hadn't let anyone near. The rumors had grown in the silence. Some said she'd gone mad with grief. Others whispered darker things, that she'd done something to the child, that her husband's death hadn't been an accident, that she practiced some kind of backwoods witchery. None of it was substantiated, but in a town like Ridgeway, proof mattered less than reputation. She doesn't see anyone, Ethan said. No, sir, but maybe... If you explained... Against his chest, the baby made a small, rattling sound. Ethan looked down at his son's gray face and felt something crack open inside him. Pride, reputation, fear, all of it meaningless against the simple, brutal fact that he was about to watch his child die. Where does she live? Relief flooded Henry's face. End of Maple Street, past the sawmill, house with the blue door. You can't miss it. Thank you. Ethan's voice cracked. Thank you, Henry. The boy nodded quickly and disappeared into the snow. Ethan adjusted his grip on the baby and started walking. Shunned? Maple Street petered out into scrub pine and frozen mud. The sawmill loomed dark and silent, its blade motionless beneath a cap of snow. Beyond it, set back from the road and half hidden by trees, stood a small clapboard house. The door was painted a faded, weary blue. No smoke came from the chimney, no light showed in the windows. Ethan almost turned back, but then the baby shuddered and he forced himself up the porch steps. He knocked. The sound echoed dull and flat. Snow hissed against the roof. Nothing. Mrs. Hart? His voice felt loud in the stillness. Please, I need help. Silence. Then, from inside, the soft creak of floorboards. Go away. The voice was female, low, and utterly devoid of warmth. My son is dying, Ethan said. He's 3 days old and he's starving. Please. I can't help you. You're the only one who can. Desperation bled through every word. Everyone else has turned me away. You're my last chance. A pause, longer this time. Then, I don't have what you're asking for. Henry Dobbs said, Henry Dobbs doesn't know what he's talking about. Sharper now, defensive. Leave, before the storm gets worse. Ethan looked down at his son. The baby's eyes were half open, unseen. His tiny chest barely moved. And something in Ethan, some last reservoir of strength he didn't know he possessed, refused to break. I'm not leaving, he said quietly. I'll stand here until morning if I have to. I'll freeze to death on your porch with my boy in my arms. But I'm not walking away. Silence. Please, Ethan whispered. He's all I have left. For a long moment, nothing. Then the scrape of a bolt, and the blue door opened a crack. The woman inside was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back severe and eyes that held a kind of exhausted wariness. She wore a simple brown dress and a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She looked at Ethan, then at the bundle against his chest, and her expression shifted, just for a second, into something raw and unguarded. How old? She asked. 3 days. The mother? Dead. Childbirth. Lydia's jaw tightened. She stared at the baby, and Ethan saw her hands clench in the fabric of her shawl. If I help you, she said slowly, they'll say worse things about me than they already do. You understand that? I don't care what they say. You will, When they stop selling you flour, when they spit at you in the street. Her voice was flat, matter of fact. You'll care then. He'll be dead by then, Ethan said, so it won't matter. Something flickered across Lydia's face. Grief, recognition, or maybe just bone-deep weariness. She looked at him for a long moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. Come inside. Issam. The house was cold but clean. A single lamp burned on a small table. The main room held a rocking chair, a narrow bed, a stove with banked coals. Everything was spare and orderly, almost aggressively so, as if the act of keeping things tidy was the only thing holding chaos at bay. Lydia closed the door and moved to the stove, adding wood with quick, practiced motions. Sit, she said, nodding toward the rocking chair. Ethan sat, still cradling the baby. The warmth from the stove began to seep into his frozen limbs, bringing with it a painful prickling sensation. He watched Lydia move around the room, lighting another lamp, pulling a knitted blanket from a trunk, filling a kettle with water. When did he last eat? She asked. He hasn't. Not since... Ethan swallowed. Not since my wife died. Lydia's hand stilled on the kettle. 3 days? I tried. Goat's milk, sugar water, everything I could think of. He won't take it. He's too weak. She set the kettle on the stove, then turned to face him fully. Let me see him. Ethan stood and carefully unwrapped the quilt. The baby lay limp in his arms, skin mottled and cold. Lydia approached slowly, and when she looked down at the infant, her breath caught, a small, sharp sound. He looks like... She stopped, shook her head. May I? Ethan transferred the baby into her arms. Lydia held him with a kind of careful reverence, her fingers checking his temperature, his pulse, the faint flutter of breath. Her face was very still. He's hypothermic, she said quietly, and severely dehydrated. Even if he feeds, there's no guarantee. I know, Ethan's voice broke, but I have to try. Lydia looked at him then, really looked, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to the marrow. What's his name? I couldn't. The admission felt like failure. I didn't want to name him if he was just going to. He needs a name, Lydia said firmly, even if it's only for tonight. Ethan thought of Martha, of the way she used to hum while she sewed, of her plans for the garden come spring. Samuel, he said, after her father. Samuel. Lydia tested the name, then nodded. All right, Samuel. Let's see if we can keep you here a little longer. She moved to the bed and sat down, arranging pillows against the wall. Then, with movements that were both brisk and unbearably gentle, she unfastened her dress. Ethan turned away quickly, staring at the wall, his face burning. Mr. Cole? Lydia's voice was calm. I'm going to need you to watch, in case he doesn't latch, in case something goes wrong. Ethan forced himself to turn back. Lydia had the baby positioned against her chest, her hand supporting his head. She guided him to her breast, and for a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Samuel didn't move, didn't respond. Come on, Lydia murmured. Come on, sweetheart. She adjusted his position, tried again. And then, so faint Ethan almost missed it, the baby's mouth twitched, moved, latched. The relief that crashed over Ethan nearly took him to his knees. He sank into the rocking chair, his hands shaking, as Samuel began to nurse, weak, unsteady, but alive, fighting. Lydia's eyes were closed, her face tipped back against the pillows. She held Samuel with infinite care, her hand moving in small, soothing circles on his back. And Ethan saw, for just a moment, the ghost of who she must have been before grief carved her into someone unrecognizable, a mother holding her child, fierce and tender and utterly present. Time moved strangely. The wind howled. The stove crackled. Samuel nursed, stopped, slept, woke, and nursed again. Lydia didn't speak, and Ethan didn't know what to say. Gratitude felt too small. Apology felt presumptuous. So he sat in silence and watched his son come back to life, one slow breath at a time. It was near midnight when Lydia finally stirred. He's stronger, she said softly. Not out of danger, but stronger. Thank you. Ethan's voice was hoarse. I don't know how to... Don't! Lydia cut him off, not unkindly. I didn't do this for thanks. Why did you do it? She looked down at Samuel, her expression unreadable. Because I know what it is to lose a child, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. The weight of that statement settled between them. Ethan thought of the rumors, the whispers, the way people spoke about Lydia Hart like she was something dangerous and unknowable, and he thought about how she'd opened her door when everyone else had locked theirs. I'm sorry, he said. For your loss. Lydia's mouth tightened. So am I. She transferred Samuel back into Ethan's arms with careful precision. He'll need to feed every 2 hours, maybe less. Can you stay? Ethan blinked. Here? Unless you want to carry him back through a blizzard to a freezing cabin. Her tone was dry. He needs warmth, food, consistency, and you look like you're about to fall over. I can manage. You can barely stand. Lydia rose from the bed, refastening her dress. The bed is yours. I'll take the chair. I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm telling. She pulled the rocking chair closer to the stove and wrapped herself in a blanket. Sleep while you can. When he wakes, bring him to me. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to insist he could handle it alone, but exhaustion was pulling at him like a physical weight, and Samuel felt warm and solid against his chest for the first time in 3 days. So he nodded, lay down on the narrow bed with his son tucked against him, and let sleep take him under. He woke to the sound of crying, not the weak, desperate mewling of before. This was louder, demanding, alive. Ethan sat up, disoriented. The room was dim, the stove glowing soft. Lydia stood by the window, silhouetted against the pale pre-dawn light, holding Samuel. He's hungry, she said without turning. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his body aching and stiff. Lydia settled back into the rocking chair and began to nurse. Samuel latched immediately this time, greedy and sure, and the sound he made, half grunt, half sigh, was the most beautiful thing Ethan had ever heard. He's going to be all right, Lydia said quietly. I think he's going to make it. Ethan sank onto the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands. The relief was so vast it felt like drowning. I don't know how to thank you. Then don't. Lydia's voice was gentle. Just take care of him. That's enough. Outside, the storm had passed. Snow lay thick and white over everything, muffling sound, softening edges. Ridgway would wake soon. People would see Ethan's tracks leading to the blue door. They would know he'd come here, and they would talk. Let them, Ethan thought fiercely. Let them say whatever they wanted. His son was alive, nothing else mattered. But as the sun rose and light filled the small, quiet room, he looked at Lydia, this stranger who had saved his child when the entire town had turned away, and wondered what price she would pay for her compassion. By mid-morning, Samuel had nursed 3 more times. Each feeding was stronger than the last. His color improved from gray to pale pink. His eyes, when they opened, were alert and focused. He looked, Ethan thought, with something like wonder, like a baby who intended to live. Lydia moved around the house with quiet efficiency, heating water, preparing thin broth, checking Samuel's temperature. She didn't speak much, but her competence was reassuring. She knew what she was doing. She'd done this before. You should eat, she said, ladling broth into a bowl and handing it to Ethan. He accepted it gratefully. What about you? I'll eat later. She returned to the stove, stirring the pot with slow, methodical strokes. Ethan watched her as he ate. In daylight, he could see the lines of strain around her eyes, the thinness of her wrists, the way her dress hung loose on her frame. She looked like someone who'd forgotten how to take care of herself, or had decided it wasn't worth the effort. How long since your husband died, Via? He asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. I'm sorry, that's not... 2 years. Lydia didn't look up. Logging accident. Tree fell wrong. And the baby? Her stirring slowed. 3 months ago, born too early. Lived for 2 days. The stark simplicity of her words was somehow worse than any elaborate explanation. Ethan set down his bowl, his appetite gone. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Lydia's voice was flat. Doesn't change anything. No, Ethan agreed quietly. It doesn't. She turned to face him then, her expression unreadable. You should know what you're walking into. When you leave here, when people find out. I don't care, You will. She moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered street. They'll say I've bewitched you, that I'm trying to replace what I lost by stealing your son. They'll say worse things, too, things I won't repeat. She paused. They might refuse to do business with you, might make your life here impossible. Ethan stood, crossing to stand beside her. Then I'll go somewhere else. With a newborn? In winter? If I have to. Lydia looked at him, something shifting in her expression. You really mean that? My son is alive because of you, Ethan said simply. Whatever consequences come from that, I'll face them, gladly. For a moment, Lydia's careful composure cracked. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, and she turned away quickly, pressing her palms against the windowsill. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. They'll destroy you, she whispered, the way they destroyed me. Ethan thought about the doors slammed in his face, the judgment in Martha's final days, the casual cruelty of people who called themselves righteous. I think, he said slowly, they already tried. Lydia made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. She stayed at the window, her shoulders rigid, and Ethan gave her space. He understood suddenly that her isolation wasn't entirely imposed from outside. Part of it was armor, a way to survive when the world had proven itself unworthy of trust. Behind them, Samuel stirred and whimpered. Lydia turned immediately, her moment of vulnerability shuddered away. He needs changing, she said, all business again. There are cloths in the trunk. Do you know how? Martha showed me. Once, Ethan felt the familiar ache of her absence. I'll manage. He did, though his hands were clumsy and uncertain. Lydia watched with a critical eye, offering terse corrections, support his head. Tighter on the left. Don't forget the powder. Until Samuel was clean and dry and wrapped in a fresh blanket. Better, she said, a hint of approval in her voice. Samuel yawned, a tiny, perfect gesture, and Ethan felt his heart turn over. 3 days ago, he'd been preparing to bury this child next to his mother. Now Samuel was yawning, eating, living. I should go soon, Ethan said reluctantly. Check on the cabin, see what needs doing. He'll need to feed again in an hour. I'll be back before then. Lydia hesitated. People will see you coming and going. Let them. Ethan. The use of his first name startled them both. She pressed on. I'm trying to protect you. Once you're associated with me, there's no coming back from it. Maybe I don't want to come back from it, Ethan said quietly. Maybe the people who'd turn their backs on a dying baby aren't people whose good opinion I need. Lydia stared at him, something complex and painful moving behind her eyes. Then she nodded, just once, and turned away. Ethan bundled Samuel carefully and stepped out into the cold. The snow was knee-deep in places, pristine and blinding in the morning sun. He could see the single line of his tracks from last night, already half filled. By tonight, they'd be gone, but new tracks would replace them. He started walking. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, cold, empty, haunted by absence. Martha's sewing basket sat by the window. Her shawl hung on its peg. The bed where she'd died was stripped bare. The linens burned, but Ethan could still see her there if he looked too long. He didn't look. Instead, he built up the fire, heated water, did the small necessary tasks of keeping a household functional. Samuel slept through it all, warm and peaceful in his makeshift cradle. Every few minutes, Ethan found himself checking, hand on the tiny chest, feeling for breath, for the steady beat of a heart that refused to quit. An hour passed, then 2. Ethan knew he needed to get back, but the thought of walking through town in daylight, of facing questions and stares, made him hesitate. Coward, he thought viciously. Your son needs to eat and you're worried about gossip. He wrapped Samuel up, locked the cabin, and headed back toward Maple Street. The town was awake now. People moved along the main street, shoveling snow, conducting business. Ethan saw heads turn as he passed, saw the moment recognition hit. That's Ethan Cole, the one whose wife just died. What's he doing with the baby? Where's he been? Mrs. Henshaw stood outside the mercantile, sweeping the porch. She watched him approach with narrowed eyes. "Mr. Cole." "Ma'am, baby looks better than he did yesterday. He's getting care." "What kind of care?" Her tone was sharp with implication. Ethan met her gaze steadily. "The kind that kept him alive." He walked on before she could respond. Behind him, he heard her call out to someone, "Martha! Martha, come here!" and knew the rumors were already spreading. By the time he reached the blue door, his jaw ached from clenching. He knocked, and Lydia answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting. Her eyes swept over him, taking inventory. "Anyone say anything?" "Does it matter?" "It will." But she stood aside, letting him in. The house was warm, the stove radiating steady heat. Lydia had laid out fresh cloths and blankets on the bed. She'd prepared more broth. Everything was ready, organized with the precision of someone who needed control in a world that had offered her none. Samuel woke and began to fuss. Lydia took him without a word, settling into the rocking chair with practiced ease. Ethan watched the baby latch and nurse, and felt gratitude so sharp it was almost painful. "I need to figure out what to do," he said. "Long term, I can't keep imposing on you." "You need to keep him fed," Lydia said practically. "That's what you need to do. Everything else is secondary." "But I can't expect you to—" "What you expect doesn't matter." She looked up at him, her expression fierce. "I opened the door. I made a choice. Now we deal with the consequences." "We? Do you think they're going to blame you?" Lydia's laugh was bitter. "No, they'll say I seduced you, trapped you, took advantage of your grief. You're the victim. I'm the witch." She paused. "So yes, we." Ethan sank into the chair opposite her. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Lydia repeated the word like it was foreign. "When was anything about this fair?" He had no answer for that. They sat in silence, the only sound Samuel's soft grunting as he nursed and the crackle of the fire. Outside, footsteps crunched past in the snow, once, twice, 3 times, people finding excuses to walk by. To see. "They're watching," Lydia said quietly. "I know. It's going to get worse." "I know that too." She looked at him then, really looked, with something like wonder in her eyes. "You're not going to leave, are you?" "No," Ethan said simply. "I'm not." Lydia's breath caught. She bent her head over Samuel, hiding her face, but not before Ethan saw the tears slide down her cheeks, silent, almost involuntary, as if her body was releasing grief she couldn't afford to acknowledge. He let her cry, sat quietly while she wept over a baby who wasn't hers, in a house that had become a prison, for a life that had broken her in ways he was only beginning to understand. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "If you're staying, we need rules. All right? You help with everything. Firewood, water, cooking, cleaning. I'm not your servant." "Agreed." "You don't ask about my past. I don't ask about yours." Ethan thought of Martha, of the secret she'd carried. "Agreed. And when Samuel is strong enough, when he doesn't need me anymore, you take him and go. Build your life somewhere else, somewhere people won't remember." This Ethan couldn't agree to, not yet, but he nodded anyway, knowing that when the time came, he'd find a way to convince her. Because he was beginning to understand something Lydia didn't yet see. She'd saved his son, but maybe, just maybe, his son could save her too. "One more thing," Lydia said. "What?" "If they come for me, if they try to run me out or hurt me, you take Samuel and go. You don't defend me. You don't stand in their way. You protect your son and yourself." Her voice was iron. "Promise me." Ethan looked at this woman who'd given everything to a stranger's child, who'd faced down her own grief to offer mercy when no one else would, and knew he was about to lie to her. "I promise," he said. Lydia's shoulders relaxed fractionally. She looked down at Samuel, now sleeping against her chest, milk-drunk and peaceful. "Good," she whispered. "That's good." But Ethan had already made a different promise. To himself, to Samuel, to the ghost of Martha, who'd taught him what it meant to love someone society deemed unworthy. When they came for Lydia Hart, and he knew they would, he wouldn't run. He'd stand beside her and dare them to break them both. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The snow began to melt. And in a small house with a blue door, two people bound by grief and necessity began the fragile, uncertain work of keeping a child alive in a world that had tried its best to let him die. The town was watching. Let them watch. The first 3 days passed in a rhythm dictated entirely by Samuel's needs. Feed, change, sleep, repeat. Ethan moved between the cabin and Lydia's house like a man caught between two worlds, one filled with ghosts, the other with a strange, tentative kind of hope. He kept his promise about helping, chopped wood until his shoulders ached, hauled water from the well behind the house, breaking through the ice each morning, learned to cook simple meals under Lydia's terse instruction, more salt, less water, don't let it burn, and discovered she was right about everything, though she never gloated. They spoke only when necessary. Lydia maintained her walls with the vigilance of someone who'd learned that letting people close meant letting them hurt you. But sometimes, in the quiet hours when Samuel slept between feedings, Ethan would catch her watching the baby with an expression so raw it felt like witnessing something sacred and private. On the fourth morning, the knock came. Ethan was at the stove, attempting to make coffee without Lydia's supervision, when 3 sharp raps echoed through the house. Lydia, who'd been folding cloths at the table, went rigid. Samuel, asleep in his cradle near the fire, didn't stir. "Don't answer it," she said quietly. The knock came again, more insistent. Then a voice, female, cold, authoritative. "Mrs. Hart, we know you're in there." Lydia closed her eyes briefly, her jaw set. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said to Ethan, "town council president. She's been waiting for an excuse." "An excuse for what?" Before Lydia could answer, the voice came again. "We need to speak with you. It concerns the welfare of a child." Ethan's blood ran cold. Lydia stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled just slightly. "Stay here with Samuel," she said, "no matter what you hear." "Lydia, stay. Here." She crossed to the door and opened it just wide enough to reveal 3 women standing on the porch. Mrs. Pruitt, iron-haired and thin-lipped, Mrs. Henshaw from the Mercantile, and a younger woman Ethan didn't recognize, holding a leather-bound ledger. "Mrs. Hart," Mrs. Pruitt said, her tone suggesting she was addressing something distasteful. "We need to discuss Mr. Cole and the infant." "There's nothing to discuss." Lydia kept her body blocking the doorway, her voice level. "Mr. Cole's son was starving. I'm providing care. That's all." "That's all?" Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose. "You're living here alone with an unmarried man, providing care of an intimate nature. Surely you understand how this appears." "I understand that a child was dying and everyone else in this town was willing to let it happen." Mrs. Henshaw flinched, but Mrs. Pruitt's expression didn't waver. "We understand Mr. Cole's circumstances were difficult. However, the solution he's chosen is inappropriate and potentially dangerous." "Dangerous?" Lydia's voice sharpened. "The baby was 3 days without food. Another day and he'd have been dead. What exactly is dangerous about preventing that?" "Your influence, Mrs. Hart." The younger woman spoke now, consulting her ledger. "You're a widow living in isolation. You've refused all offers of Christian fellowship. There are concerns about your stability." Ethan had heard enough. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled the door wider, stepping into view. "My son is alive because of Mrs. Hart's kindness," he said, his voice carrying an edge he didn't try to soften. "If you have concerns, direct them to me." Mrs. Pruitt's gaze swept over him, calculating. "Mr. Cole, we sympathize with your loss, truly, but you must see that this arrangement is untenable. An unwed woman nursing another woman's child, with the father living under her roof." "I'm not living here," Ethan interrupted. "I stay at my cabin. I come here when Samuel needs to feed." "Multiple times a day," Mrs. Henshaw said quietly. "People have noticed." "Of course they have." Lydia's voice was bitter. "This town has nothing better to do than count how many times a starving baby eats." Mrs. Pruitt drew herself up. "We have a responsibility to the moral welfare of this community. If you won't consider how this looks, we'll be forced to involve the county authorities." "On what grounds?" Ethan demanded. on the grounds that a child's well-being may be compromised by an inappropriate living situation. Mrs. Pruitt's smile was thin and cold. There are proper channels for these things, Mr. Cole. Orphanages, church families willing to take in foundlings. Your son deserves better than this. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Ethan felt rage rise hot and immediate in his chest. My son deserves to live, which he wouldn't be doing if I'd listened to people like you. Mr. Cole, you turned me away. His voice cracked. All of you. I begged for help and you closed your doors. Don't you dare stand here now and lecture me about what's proper. Mrs. Henshaw had the grace to look ashamed. Mrs. Pruitt, however, merely pursed her lips. Emotion doesn't change propriety, Mr. Cole. If you wish to continue this arrangement, there's only one acceptable solution. Lydia stiffened. No? Marriage, Mrs. Pruitt continued as if Lydia hadn't spoken. Make it legal and respectable, or we'll be forced to petition for the child's removal to a suitable home. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stared at Mrs. Pruitt, trying to process what she'd just said. Marriage. To Lydia. A woman he'd known for 4 days. A stranger bound to him only by desperation and Samuel's need to survive. You can't be serious, Lydia said, her voice hollow. I'm entirely serious. Mrs. Pruitt consulted the younger woman's ledger. We'll give you 1 week to make a decision. Either marry and legitimize this arrangement, or the child will be placed with a proper family. She snapped the ledger shut. Those are your options, She turned and descended the porch steps, her companions following. Mrs. Henshaw glanced back once, her expression troubled, but she didn't speak. They disappeared into the snow-bright morning, leaving Ethan and Lydia frozen in the doorway. Lydia moved first. She stepped back inside and closed the door with careful precision, as if afraid that slamming it would shatter something vital. Then she crossed to the rocking chair and sat down, her hands gripped white-knuckled in her lap. They can't actually do that, Ethan said. Can they? Take him away? Yes. Lydia's voice was flat. County has an orphanage in Sterling. If they petition and claim the child's in an immoral environment, a judge will grant it, especially when one of the parties is... She gestured at herself, the movement sharp and bitter. Me. Ethan sank onto the bed, his mind racing. Marriage. The word felt absurd, impossible. He'd buried Martha 4 days ago. The grief was still fresh and bleeding, and yet Samuel was sleeping peacefully by the fire, his chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of a baby who expected to live. A baby who would be ripped away and sent to an institution if Ethan didn't act. What if we did it? He said quietly. Lydia's head snapped up. What? Got married, just legally, on paper. The words felt strange in his mouth. We wouldn't have to... It wouldn't be real, just enough to satisfy them. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. They want us to be respectable, fine. We'll give them respectable. But it doesn't have to change anything between us. Lydia stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. You'd tie yourself to me permanently? Just to keep them from taking Samuel? Yes, you'd ruin any chance you have of a normal life. My normal life ended when Martha died, Ethan said, the truth of it settling heavy in his chest. This isn't about normal, it's about keeping my son. And what about when he's older? When he doesn't need me anymore? Lydia's voice rose, edged with something like panic. You'll be stuck with a wife you never wanted, in a marriage everyone knows is a sham? Then we'll deal with it then. Ethan met her eyes steadily. Right now, all I care about is making sure they can't take him. If that means marriage, then that's what we'll do. Lydia stood abruptly, pacing to the window. She pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. You don't understand what you'd be taking on, the way people look at me, the things they say. I've seen how they look at you, Ethan said. I've also seen how you are with Samuel. I know which one matters. She let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. You're insane. Probably. He stood, crossing to stand beside her. Outside, the town spread out like a judgment. Smoke rising from chimneys, people moving along the street, lives continuing with casual normalcy. But I'm also desperate, and you're the only person who gave a damn when it counted. Lydia turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for something. Doubt, deception, regret. Whatever she found made her shoulders sag. If we do this, she said slowly, it's a business arrangement, nothing more. Agreed. You keep your space, I keep mine. All right? And when Samuel is old enough, when he's safe, we revisit this. See if there's a way to... She trailed off, unable to finish. To what? Separate? Ethan considered it. If that's what you want. What I want, Lydia said quietly, is to not be a burden or a trap. The vulnerability in those words caught Ethan off guard. He saw her then, not the withdrawn widow or the town pariah, but a woman who'd been abandoned so thoroughly she'd learned to expect nothing from anyone. A woman who'd opened her door despite knowing the cost, because she couldn't bear to watch another child die. You're not a burden, he said, and this isn't a trap, it's a choice, one we're both making. Lydia studied him for a long moment. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. All right. All right? I'll marry you. The words came out steady, resigned. For Samuel's sake. Relief and something else, something more complicated, washed through Ethan. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. I'll make the arrangements. Behind them, Samuel began to fuss. Lydia moved immediately, scooping him up with practiced ease. She settled into the rocking chair and began to nurse, her face turned away, and Ethan stood watching, this woman who'd agreed to bind her life to his for a child who wasn't even hers. The weight of what they'd just decided settled over the room like snow, quiet, inexorable, changing the landscape of everything. 3 days later, they stood before Pastor Michaels in the small church office and spoke vows neither of them believed. The pastor looked uncomfortable throughout, his eyes flicking between them like he expected one to bolt. Mrs. Pruitt attended as witness, her presence a reminder that this wasn't romance, it was compliance. Do you, Ethan Cole, take this woman? Ethan's voice was steady. I do. Do you, Lydia Hart, take this man? Lydia's pause stretched just long enough to make the pastor shift nervously. Then, I do. No kiss, no celebration, just signatures on paper and a marriage certificate that felt more like a legal document than a sacred bond. Mrs. Pruitt inspected the certificate with the thoroughness of someone checking a bill of sale, then nodded curtly. Congratulations, she said, the words stripped of any warmth. I trust we won't have any further concerns about propriety. They left the church in silence. Snow had started falling again, soft and persistent. Ethan carried Samuel, bundled tight against the cold. Lydia walked beside him, her face unreadable. Where to now? She asked as they reached the main street. Ethan looked at his cabin, then at the house with the blue door. Your place is warmer and closer to town if Samuel needs anything. You mean your place now? Lydia said quietly. Legally. The reminder sat awkward between them. Ethan shifted Samuel's weight. I mean, wherever Samuel is safest, that's still with you. Something in Lydia's expression softened fractionally. She nodded and turned toward Maple Street. They walked in silence, the town's eyes tracking their movement like predators watching prey. At the house, Lydia stopped on the porch. We should establish boundaries, she said, not looking at him. Now, before this gets complicated. All right, you take the bed. I'll take the chair. Lydia, you can't sleep in a chair. I've done it for 3 months. Her voice was final. I'll manage. Ethan wanted to argue, but recognized the set of her jaw. This was about control. One of the few things she had left. Fine, but we trade off. 1 week each. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. Fair enough. Inside, she moved through her evening routine with the same methodical precision, banking the fire, preparing tomorrow's supplies, checking that everything was in order. Ethan watched, realizing this was how she survived, by controlling what she could, by building structure where chaos had taken everything else. He laid Samuel in the cradle and began his own tasks, bringing in firewood, checking the water supply, small acts of usefulness that made him feel less like an intruder. They moved around each other carefully, two people learning to share space without touching. Night fell. Samuel woke for his feeding, and Lydia settled into the rocker with him. Ethan sat at the table, pretending to read a newspaper 3 days old while she nursed. The domesticity of it felt surreal, like playing house in the ruins of their separate griefs. "Can I ask you something?" Lydia's voice broke the silence. "Yes?" "What was she like?" "Your wife." Ethan set down the paper. No one had asked him that. Not once since Martha died. They'd offered condolences and platitudes, but never simple curiosity about who she'd been. "Quiet," he said slowly. "But not shy. She just chose her words carefully, like she'd learned that speaking too much could be dangerous." He paused, remembering. She loved mornings. Used to wake before dawn just to watch the sun come up. Said it felt like the world was giving her a fresh start every day. Lydia's hand stilled on Samuel's back. "She sounds lovely." She was. The ache of her absence was still sharp. "What about your husband?" "James?" Lydia's voice was distant. "He was steady, kind. He didn't talk much either, which suited me fine." She looked down at Samuel. "He wanted children. We'd been trying for 2 years when he died. The baby was—" She stopped, swallowed. "The baby was all I had left of him." "I'm sorry." "So am I." She was quiet for a moment. "When the baby died, I thought that was it. That I'd used up all my chances at family, at mattering to someone." She glanced up at Ethan, her eyes bright. "And then you knocked on my door." The weight of that statement, of how much had changed in less than a week, settled between them. Ethan thought about fate and coincidence and the strange mathematics of loss that had brought them together. "I'm glad you opened it," he said quietly. "So am I." Lydia bent her head over Samuel. "Even if this is all it ever is, even if we're just two people keeping a baby alive, that's enough." But Ethan, watching her rock his son with such tender care, suspected it was already more than that. Not love. Not yet, maybe not ever, but something deeper than convenience. A partnership forged in desperation and maintained through choice. The days developed their own rhythm. Ethan worked odd jobs in town, hauling, building, anything that paid, while Lydia cared for Samuel. Evenings they shared, cooking together in careful silence, taking turns with the baby, existing in a space that wasn't quite marriage but wasn't quite strangers either. The town watched, always watching. Mrs. Pruitt made a point of visiting the mercantile whenever Lydia shopped, her presence a reminder that their arrangement was under constant scrutiny. Other women whispered behind gloved hands. Men avoided Ethan's eyes, as if his choice to marry Lydia had somehow compromised his standing. But Samuel thrived. Within 2 weeks he'd gained weight, his cheeks filling out, his eyes bright and alert. He started smiling, random, reflexive expressions that Lydia swore meant something more. Ethan would come home to find her talking to the baby in low, gentle tones, telling him stories about nothing in particular. "He likes your voice," Ethan observed one evening. Lydia looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "He's probably just reacting to sound." "Maybe. Or maybe he knows you saved his life." She turned away, but not before Ethan saw her expression soften. These small moments, her guard dropping, just for a second, were becoming more frequent, as if the simple act of caring for Samuel was teaching her to trust again. 1 month after the wedding, Ethan came home to find Lydia standing at the stove, Samuel propped on her hip, humming something low and tuneless. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time she smiled, not forced or polite, but genuine. "He rolled over today," she said. "Just for a second, but he did it." "That's early, isn't it?" "A little." Pride colored her voice. "He's strong, stubborn." "Like his mother," Ethan said without thinking. The smile faltered. "Like Martha, you mean?" "No." Ethan set down his coat. "I meant like you." Lydia's eyes widened. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned abruptly back to the stove. But her shoulders had straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something that hadn't been there before. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "Wash up." They ate together, venison stew and bread Lydia had baked that morning. Samuel slept in his cradle, his breathing soft and even. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, but inside was warm. Safe. "The mercantile is hiring," Lydia said suddenly. "Mr. Henshaw mentioned it when I was there today. Said you should apply." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Mr. Henshaw spoke to you? To me?" Lydia's laugh was short. "No. He spoke near me, about how they need someone for inventory and stocking. I assume he meant for you to hear." "That's something, I guess. It's better pay than hauling, steadier." She hesitated. "If you want it." "Do you want me to take it?" Lydia met his eyes across the table. "I want Samuel to have security. If that means you working at the mercantile, then yes." But there was something else in her expression, something that suggested her concern extended beyond just Samuel. That maybe, somewhere in the past month, Ethan's well-being had started to matter to her too. He took the job. Mr. Henshaw was brusque but fair, laying out expectations with the efficiency of a man who didn't waste words. "You work hard. You get paid. You cause trouble. You're out. Clear?" "Clear." "And Cole?" Henshaw paused at the storeroom door. "I was wrong about not helping when you asked. Won't happen again." It was the closest thing to an apology Ethan would get. He nodded, accepting it, and got to work. The job was tedious but stable. Inventory, stocking, occasional customer service when Mrs. Henshaw was occupied. The townspeople who came through treated Ethan with a kind of careful neutrality, not hostile, but not warm. As if they were waiting to see if his marriage to Lydia would prove itself scandal or success. Lydia, meanwhile, ventured out more. Not much, she still avoided crowds and kept her errands brief, but she stopped hiding. Walked through town with her head up, Samuel bundled against her chest, daring anyone to comment. Most didn't, but some did. Ethan heard about it from Henshaw, who heard it from his wife. A group of women at the church social had suggested that Lydia's presence was inappropriate, given her history, that perhaps she shouldn't be allowed around other people's children. "What history?" Ethan demanded. Henshaw shrugged uncomfortably. "You know how people talk, about her baby, about how it died." "Oh, it was born premature, that's not a crime." "No, but people wonder." Henshaw lowered his voice. "They say she was too calm after, that she didn't grieve right, and that makes them nervous." Ethan felt rage build hot and immediate. "She grieved plenty. Just because she didn't perform it for public consumption doesn't mean—" "I know." Henshaw held up his hands. "I'm just telling you what's being said, so you can prepare." That night, Ethan watched Lydia put Samuel to bed with infinite care, her hands gentle on his back, her voice soft as she sang something wordless and sad. And he thought about a town that would judge her for loving too quietly, for surviving her loss without their permission. "Lydia," he said when she finally sat down, "if people are bothering you, saying things, you need to tell me." She looked at him, her expression guarded. "Why?" "Because you're my wife, and they don't get to treat you like what I am?" Her voice was sharp. "A widow who lost everything? A woman desperate enough to marry a stranger? Like you're anything less than decent." Lydia's breath caught. She stared at him, and Ethan saw the exact moment his words landed, saw her walls crack just slightly, letting in light she'd kept locked out for months. "Decent," she repeated quietly. "No one's called me that in a long time." "Then they're fools." She looked away, blinking rapidly. When she spoke again, her voice was thick. "You don't owe me this. The defense. The kindness. We had an arrangement, that's all." "Is it?" Ethan leaned forward. "Because it feels like more than that now." "Don't." Lydia stood abruptly. "Don't make this into something it's not. We're keeping Samuel safe. That's the only thing that matters." "And what about keeping you safe?" The question hung between them. Lydia's hands clenched in her skirt, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I don't need saving." Everyone needs saving sometimes," Ethan said quietly. "You saved me. Saved Samuel. Maybe it's time someone returned the favor." Lydia's eyes shone with unshed tears. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and fled to the bedroom, closing the door with careful precision behind her. Ethan sat in the quiet house, listening to her muffled weeping through the thin wall, and knew they'd crossed some invisible line. This wasn't just an arrangement anymore. It was something messier, more complicated, something that looked dangerously close to caring. The next morning, Lydia didn't mention her tears, and Ethan didn't bring them up. They moved around each other with the careful politeness of people pretending the night before hadn't happened, though something had shifted in the air between them, something fragile and unspoken. Samuel, oblivious to the tension, demanded attention with increasingly vocal protests. At 6 weeks old, he had discovered his voice and seemed determined to use it. Lydia responded to every cry with patience that seemed inexhaustible, while Ethan marveled at how she could distinguish between hungry, tired, and simply bored. "How do you know?" he asked one afternoon, watching her bounce Samuel on her hip. "Know what?" "What he needs, what each cry means." Lydia glanced at him, surprised by the question. "You just listen, pay attention. He'll tell you if you're willing to hear it." She shifted Samuel to her other arm. "Here, you try." She transferred the baby before Ethan could protest. Samuel immediately screwed up his face, preparing to wail, but Ethan instinctively began the same bouncing motion he'd watched Lydia use. The baby paused, considering, then settled against Ethan's chest with a small sigh. "See?" Lydia's smile was quick and genuine. "He knows you." The words struck something deep in Ethan's chest. He looked down at his son, this tiny person who'd survived against impossible odds, and felt the full weight of what that meant. Samuel knew him, trusted him, and trusted Lydia just as completely. The thought was still settling when a sharp knock rattled the door. Lydia's smile vanished instantly, her body going rigid. Ethan handed Samuel back to her and crossed to answer it, already bracing for whatever fresh judgment the town had decided to deliver. But it wasn't Mrs. Pruitt or the church ladies. It was Henry Dobbs, the postal clerk's apprentice, his face flushed and anxious beneath his cap. "Mr. Cole," he said breathlessly, "sorry to bother you, but there's trouble at the mercantile. Mr. Henshaw sent me to fetch you." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind with Mrs. Pruitt and the county clerk." Henry glanced past Ethan to where Lydia stood frozen. "They're asking questions about the baby, about the marriage. Mr. Henshaw thought you should know." Ethan grabbed his coat. "Stay here," he told Lydia. "Keep the door locked." "Ethan," but he was already moving, following Henry through the snow-packed streets toward the mercantile. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. They'd been careful, legal, everything by the book. What could Mrs. Pruitt possibly... He pushed through the mercantile door to find Mrs. Pruitt standing at the counter with a thin man in a dark suit, his spectacles perched severely on his nose. Mr. Henshaw stood behind the counter, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. "Ah, Mr. Cole." Mrs. Pruitt's smile was razor-thin. "How convenient. This is Mr. Thaddeus Werner, county clerk. He has some questions about your arrangement." Werner consulted a ledger, his finger tracking down a page. "Mr. Cole, I understand you entered into marriage with Mrs. Lydia Hart approximately 6 weeks ago. Is that correct?" "Yes." Ethan kept his voice steady. "What's this about?" "I've received a formal complaint suggesting that said marriage was contracted under false pretenses. Specifically, that it was designed solely to circumvent proper child welfare procedures." "That's ridiculous," Ethan said flatly. "We married because we chose to, because it made sense for Samuel's well-being." "Samuel being your infant son," Werner made a note, "who resides primarily with Mrs. Hart." "Who resides with his parents," Ethan corrected. "My wife and myself." Mrs. Pruitt's lips pursed. "A wife you didn't know 6 weeks ago. A wife who, by all accounts, lives a life of deliberate isolation and whose own child died under mysterious circumstances." The room went very quiet. Henshaw's hands flattened on the counter. "That's enough, Constance." "Is it?" Mrs. Pruitt turned to him, her voice acid-sweet. "We're simply ensuring that the child's interests are protected. Surely you agree that's important." "I agree that you're overstepping," Henshaw shot back. The Coles have done nothing wrong. Their marriage is legal and their son is thriving. Werner cleared his throat diplomatically. Nevertheless, given the unusual circumstances, I'm required to conduct a formal inquiry. I'll need to visit the residence, interview both parties, and assess the child's living conditions. When? Ethan demanded. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Werner snapped his ledger shut. Please ensure both you and Mrs. Cole are present. Mrs. Pruitt smiled triumphantly. We're simply doing our duty, Mr. Cole. I'm sure you understand. Ethan understood perfectly. This was retaliation, punishment for defying the town's expectations, for choosing Lydia when everyone else had written her off. And if Werner decided their marriage was fraudulent, if he determined Samuel was in an unsuitable environment, they could still lose everything. He left the mercantile without another word, his mind already racing ahead to how to prepare Lydia for what was coming. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual, weighted with dread. Lydia opened the door before he could knock, her face pale. I saw Henry leave. What happened? Ethan told her. With every word, he watched her withdraw further into herself, her shoulders curling inward like she was bracing for a blow. They're going to take him, she said when he finished. That's what this is. They've decided we're not fit, and they're building a case. We won't let them. How? Lydia's voice rose, sharp with panic. You heard what Werner said. They think our marriage is fake, that I did something to my baby. Lydia. Ethan caught her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. We're going to show them exactly what we are. Two people who got married, who are raising a child together, who have built a life. That's the truth. The truth is we're strangers who made a desperate bargain, Lydia said bitterly. They'll see right through us. Then we make them see something else. Ethan's grip tightened. Tomorrow, when Werner comes, we show him a family. Not perfect, not conventional, but real. Can you do that? Lydia stared at him, her eyes wide and frightened. Then, slowly, she nodded. I can try. That night, they stayed up late planning. Ethan would handle the legal questions, dates, documents, anything requiring precision. Lydia would focus on Samuel's care, demonstrating her competence. They rehearsed answers to potential questions, their voices low so as not to wake the baby. What if he asks why we married so quickly? Lydia said. We tell him the truth, that you saved Samuel's life and I wasn't going to let the town punish you for it. What if he asks about us? About whether we... She broke off, cheeks coloring. Whether we share a bed. Ethan kept his voice neutral. We tell him our private arrangements are private. He'll assume we're lying. Let him assume. Ethan met her eyes across the table. What matters is Samuel, nothing else. Lydia nodded slowly, but her hands were shaking. Ethan reached across the table without thinking, covering her fingers with his. She startled at the contact, but didn't pull away. We're going to get through this, he said quietly. Together. Lydia's throat worked. Why are you doing this? You could walk away. Tell them it was all my idea. Save yourself and Samuel. Because that's not who I am. Ethan's voice was firm. And because you deserve better than being thrown away again. Something broke in Lydia's expression. She turned her hand under his, lacing their fingers together with a grip that felt like drowning and salvation all at once. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. They sat like that until the candle burned low, hands clasped across the table, while Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle and the night pressed cold against the windows. Werner arrived precisely at 9, accompanied by Mrs. Pruitt and a woman Ethan didn't recognize, middle-aged, severe, carrying a leather satchel. Werner introduced her as Mrs. Adelaide Foster, County Social Welfare Officer. She'll be conducting the child assessment, Werner explained, removing his hat. Standard procedure. Lydia stood near the stove, Samuel in her arms, her face composed but pale. Ethan positioned himself beside her, close enough to present unity without appearing defensive. Mrs. Foster's eyes swept the room, cataloging everything. The tidy kitchen, the neatly made bed, the cradle lined with clean blankets, Samuel's clothes folded in a basket. Evidence of a household maintained with care. May I examine the child? Mrs. Foster asked. Lydia's arms tightened fractionally around Samuel before she nodded and transferred him to Mrs. Foster's waiting hands. The older woman laid Samuel on the table with practiced efficiency, checking his weight, his alertness, the condition of his skin and clothing. "He's well fed," she observed. "Alert, no signs of neglect." "Of course there aren't," Ethan said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "He's our son." Werner was taking notes. "Mrs. Cole, how long have you been nursing the child?" "Since he was 3 days old," Lydia answered steadily, "when his father brought him to me." "And prior to your marriage, Mr. Cole resided here with you?" "No." Lydia's voice didn't waver. "He stayed at his own cabin. He came here only when Samuel needed to feed. Multiple times per day. Newborns eat frequently." Lydia met Werner's eyes. "I assumed the county clerk would be familiar with basic infant care." Mrs. Pruitt's expression soured. Werner made another note, unruffled. "And the decision to marry, that came from mutual agreement?" "It came from necessity," Ethan said. "When we were told that Samuel would be removed unless we legitimized the arrangement, so we did." "Under duress, then?" "Under threat," Ethan corrected. "There's a difference." Mrs. Foster finished her examination and wrapped Samuel back in his blanket. "The child is healthy and well cared for. I see no immediate concerns regarding his physical welfare." Relief flickered across Lydia's face, quickly suppressed. Mrs. Pruitt, however, leaned forward. "What about the mother's fitness, given her history?" "What history?" Mrs. Foster's tone was crisp. "Please be specific." Mrs. Pruitt hesitated, suddenly on uncertain ground. "There are questions about her previous child, about how it died." "The baby was premature," Lydia said, her voice tight. "Born at 7 months. He lived for 2 days and then his heart stopped. There was nothing I could do." "And yet you showed no grief," Mrs. Pruitt pressed. "No tears. People noticed." "People," Lydia said softly, "don't know what I showed in private." The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Foster looked between them, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Cole, may I ask you a direct question?" Lydia nodded, wary. "Do you love this child?" The question hung in the air. Lydia looked down at Samuel, now cradled against her chest again, and Ethan saw her face transform, all the walls falling away, leaving only raw, undeniable truth. "Yes," she said simply. "More than I thought possible." "And you, Mr. Cole?" Mrs. Foster turned to Ethan. "Do you believe your wife is fit to care for your son?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "She's kept him alive when no one else would. She's fed him, comforted him, loved him like he was her own. If that's not fit, then I don't know what is." Mrs. Foster exchanged a glance with Werner, something passing between them. Werner consulted his notes one final time, then closed his ledger with decisive finality. "I see no grounds for intervention," he said. "The child is healthy, the home is adequate, and both parents appear committed to his welfare. The marriage, while unconventional in its timing, is legal and appears to be functioning." Mrs. Pruitt's face went rigid. "But my report will reflect that the Cole household meets county standards," Mrs. Foster interrupted smoothly. "I recommend no further action." The victory was so sudden, Ethan almost didn't process it. He felt Lydia sway slightly beside him and instinctively put his arm around her waist to steady her. She leaned into him without seeming to realize it, her relief palpable. Mrs. Pruitt gathered her things with jerky, furious movements. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "People will continue to talk." "Let them talk," Lydia said, finding her voice. "As long as they leave my family alone." "My family." The words resonated through the room. Mrs. Pruitt's eyes narrowed, but she swept out without another word. Werner and Mrs. Foster followed, Werner pausing at the door. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you're both doing your best in difficult circumstances. That's all anyone can ask." When they were gone, Lydia's knees buckled. Ethan caught her, guiding her to the rocking chair. She clutched Samuel to her chest, her whole body shaking. "It's over," Ethan said. "They can't touch us now." "Not legally," Lydia whispered. "But Constance Pruitt doesn't forgive." She'll find other ways. Then we'll face them. Ethan crouched beside the chair, his hand on her knee. Together, like we did today. Lydia looked at him, really looked, and something shifted in her expression. You called us a family, to Mrs. Foster. We are a family. Are we? Her voice was very soft. Or are we just playing at it? Ethan thought about the last 6 weeks, the shared meals and late nights, the way they'd learned each other's rhythms, preferences, silences, the way Lydia's face lit up when Samuel smiled, the way his chest tightened when he heard her crying through the bedroom door. I don't know, he admitted, but it feels real to me. Lydia's eyes filled. To me, too, she whispered, and that terrifies me. Why? Because I've lost everyone I've ever... She stopped, shaking her head. If I let myself believe this is real and then it falls apart, it won't fall apart. You can't promise that. No, Ethan agreed, but I can promise to try. Every day, for as long as you'll let me. Lydia searched his face, looking for deception or doubt. Whatever she found made her breath catch. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched his cheek, tentative, disbelieving, as if he might disappear under her hand. I don't know how to do this, she said. How to be a wife, a mother, how to let someone in. Neither do I, Ethan said honestly. But maybe we can figure it out together. Samuel chose that moment to fuss, breaking the spell. Lydia laughed shakily and rose to tend to him, but her hand lingered on Ethan's shoulder as she passed, brief, almost unconscious, but unmistakably real. The days that followed felt different, lighter somehow, as if the threat of losing Samuel had been the last weight holding them back from something more genuine. Lydia smiled more easily, touched Ethan's arm when she passed him. Let him help with Samuel's care instead of insisting she could manage alone. They fell into new patterns. Mornings, Ethan would wake to find Lydia already up, nursing Samuel in the pre-dawn quiet. He'd join her with coffee, and they'd sit in companionable silence while the world woke around them. Evenings, after Samuel was asleep, they'd talk, tentative at first, then with increasing openness. Ethan learned that Lydia had wanted to be a teacher before her husband died, that she loved mathematics but hated cooking, that she'd grown up in Ohio and hadn't spoken to her family in a decade. Lydia learned that Ethan had met Martha at a church social, that he'd courted her for 6 months before proposing, that his father had been a drunk who died when Ethan was 12, that he'd sworn never to be like him and spent every day terrified he'd fail. You won't, Lydia said when he confessed that fear. You're nothing like that. How do you know? Because I've seen you with Samuel, the way you hold him, talk to him, like he's precious. She paused, like we're both precious. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and true. Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand. This time, neither of them pulled away. 2 months after the county inspection, spring began to edge out winter. Snow melted into mud. Birds returned. Samuel, now 3 months old, had grown round and healthy, his eyes tracking movement, his hands grasping at anything within reach. Lydia took him outside on warm afternoons, walking along Maple Street with her head high. A few people nodded in greeting now, grudging acceptance, but acceptance nonetheless. Henshaw had spread word about how well Samuel was doing, and slowly, incrementally, the town's hostility began to thaw. But Mrs. Pruitt remained implacable. She crossed the street when she saw Lydia coming, made pointed comments at church about the sanctity of marriage and the corruption of modern morals, gathered her allies and whispered in doorways. Ethan ignored her. Lydia tried to. But the constant judgment wore on them both, a low-grade poison that seeped into even their happiest moments. It came to a head on a Sunday in April. Ethan and Lydia had decided to attend church, a show of normalcy, of respectability. They dressed carefully, Lydia in her best dress, Samuel in clothes she'd sewn herself. Walking into the sanctuary felt like entering hostile territory. People stared, some nodded, others looked away. Pastor Michaels greeted them with professional courtesy and directed them to a pew near the back. They sat, Lydia holding Samuel, Ethan acutely aware of every whisper, every glance. The service proceeded normally until the sermon. Pastor Michaels opened his Bible and began speaking about the importance of moral purity, of maintaining community standards, of not letting sin take root under the guise of charity. Ethan felt Lydia go rigid beside him. He reached for her hand, finding it ice cold. Some among us, the pastor continued, his voice carrying through the sanctuary, have chosen paths that lead others astray, have entered into arrangements that mock the sacred institution of marriage. We must not, cannot, condone such behavior, lest we lose our way. Mrs. Pruitt, seated in the front pew, nodded approvingly. Ethan stood up. The movement was sudden enough that several heads turned. Lydia grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with alarm, but Ethan gently extracted himself and stepped into the aisle. Pastor Michaels, he said, his voice carrying, I have a question. The pastor faltered, clearly not expecting interruption. Mr. Cole, this isn't the time. When my son was dying, I came to this church begging for help. You offered prayers, but no milk, no wet nurse, nothing practical. Ethan's voice was steady, but anger simmered beneath every word. When Mrs. Hart opened her door and saved his life, was that sin? Or was it the only Christian act in this entire town? Silence. Absolute and ringing. Mrs. Pruitt's face had gone purple. The circumstances were irregular, Pastor Michaels began. The circumstances were desperate, Ethan interrupted. And my wife, my legal, legitimate wife, responded with compassion when everyone else responded with judgment. If that's not godly, then I don't know what is. He turned to face the congregation, meeting their eyes one by one. We've done everything asked of us. Married legally, raised Samuel in a good home, conducted ourselves with dignity despite constant scrutiny, and still you condemn us. Why? Because we didn't do it the way you wanted? Because we didn't ask permission? No one answered. Ethan felt Lydia rise behind him, Samuel in her arms. You don't get to decide our worth, Lydia said quietly, her voice clear in the silence. You don't get to judge my fitness as a mother or his as a father. We've earned our place, our family, and we don't need your approval to keep it. She walked down the aisle, head high, Samuel nestled against her shoulder. Ethan followed, and together they left the church in ringing silence. Outside, Lydia's composure finally cracked. She leaned against the wall, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. I can't believe we just... I can, Ethan said. We should have done it weeks ago. Lydia laughed through her tears, a sound of pure relief. They're going to make our lives hell now. They were already trying. Ethan cupped her face, wiping away tears with his thumbs. At least now we've said our piece. Lydia looked at him, her eyes bright and fierce. Then, without warning, she kissed him. It was quick, almost desperate. A collision of lips that tasted like salt and defiance. Ethan froze, startled, before responding instinctively. His hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and for a moment the world contracted to just this. Her mouth on his, Samuel between them, three people choosing each other against impossible odds. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia's eyes were wide with shock at her own audacity. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... Don't apologize, Ethan said roughly. Not for that. They stared at each other, the air between them charged with everything they'd been avoiding. Then Samuel made a small sound of protest at being squished, and they both laughed, shaky, relieved, real. We should go home, Lydia said. Home. Not the house. Not the cabin. Home. Ethan took her hand, lacing their fingers together, and they walked down Maple Street in full view of anyone watching. Let them see. Let them talk. This was real now, messy and imperfect and built from desperation, but real nonetheless. And neither of them was letting go. They didn't speak about the kiss on the walk home. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just weighted with awareness, with the recognition that something fundamental had shifted between them. Samuel dozed against Lydia's shoulder, oblivious to the fact that his world had just reorganized itself around a truth his parents were only beginning to acknowledge. Inside the house, Lydia busied herself with Samuel's care, while Ethan stoked the fire to ward off the morning chill. They moved around each other with the careful choreography they'd developed over months, but now every accidental touch carried electricity. When Lydia's hand brushed his while reaching for the kettle, they both froze. When Ethan steadied her elbow as she stepped over Samuel's basket, she looked up at him with eyes that held questions neither was ready to ask aloud. "I should check the chickens," Ethan said finally, needing air, needing space to think. Lydia nodded without looking at him. "I'll start lunch." Outside, the spring air was crisp and clean. Ethan leaned against the henhouse, pressing his palms against the weathered wood, and tried to sort through the tangle in his chest. He'd kissed his wife, his real wife, not just the woman he'd married on paper to satisfy the town council, and it had felt like coming home. But Martha had been gone barely 4 months. 4 months since he'd held her hand while she slipped away. 4 months since he'd promised her ghost that he'd take care of their son. Was this betrayal, or was it survival? He didn't know anymore. The door creaked behind him. Lydia stepped out, wrapping her shawl tight against the breeze. "Samuel's sleeping," she said. "We should talk." Ethan straightened, bracing himself. "All right." Lydia came to stand beside him, her eyes on the horizon where mountains cut jagged lines against blue sky. "I shouldn't have kissed you. It was impulsive and inappropriate, and I kissed you back," Ethan interrupted quietly. "I know." She twisted her hands in her shawl, which makes this more complicated. "Does it have to be?" Lydia turned to look at him then, her expression raw. "Your wife died 4 months ago. My husband died 2 years ago, but I'm still carrying him, carrying the baby we lost. I don't know if I have room for anything else." "I'm not asking you to forget them," Ethan said. "I'll never forget Martha. But she's gone, Lydia. And I'm still here. We're still here." "Doing what? Playing house? Pretending grief doesn't exist?" "No." Ethan faced her fully. "Building something new. Something that doesn't erase what came before but doesn't get buried by it either." Lydia's eyes shone. "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I." Ethan reached for her hand, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe we can figure it out as we go." She looked down at their joined hands, her thumb tracing the calluses on his palm. "What if we try and it doesn't work? What if we ruin what we've built?" "What if we don't try and spend the rest of our lives wondering?" Ethan countered. "I'd rather fail trying than succeed at pretending." A laugh escaped Lydia, half sob, half genuine amusement. "When did you get so brave?" "When I watched you open a door everyone else had locked." He squeezed her fingers. "You saved more than Samuel that night." "I think you saved me too." Lydia's breath hitched. She stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could count the faint freckles across her nose that winter had hidden. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "So am I." "But you're willing to try anyway?" "With you?" "Yes." This kiss was different from the first. Slower, deliberate, a choice made in full knowledge rather than desperate impulse. Lydia's hands came up to frame his face, and Ethan wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. She tasted like coffee and courage, and when she made a small sound in the back of her throat, something in Ethan's chest cracked wide open. They broke apart slowly, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air. "This doesn't fix everything," Lydia said against his mouth. "I know. The town will still talk. Mrs. Pruitt will still—" "I don't care." Ethan pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "Let them talk. We know what this is." "What is it?" Lydia asked, vulnerable and wanting. "Real," Ethan said simply. "Messy and complicated and real." Lydia nodded slowly, then kissed him again, quick and fierce and full of promise. When she stepped back, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "Samuel will wake soon. We should—" "Go inside," Ethan finished. "Together." The word carried weight now. Together wasn't just proximity or shared responsibility. It was choice. It was them. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they crossed the threshold, it felt like crossing into something new. A marriage that was becoming more than survival. A family that was becoming more than necessity. Inside, Samuel was indeed awake, making the small grunting sounds that preceded a full-blown cry. Lydia scooped him up with practiced ease, settling into the rocking chair. Ethan watched her nurse their son, because Samuel was theirs now, wasn't he? Not just by circumstance, but by choice, by the daily act of showing up and caring and loving, and felt something settle in his chest. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked, catching him staring. "That this is what I want," Ethan said honestly. "You, Samuel, this life we're building." Lydia's smile was soft and wondering. "Even with all the complications?" "Especially with the complications." He crossed to them, running his hand over Samuel's downy hair. "We've earned this, whatever it becomes." The following weeks unfolded with a sweetness Ethan hadn't expected to feel again. The physical distance they'd maintained dissolved gradually, Lydia's hand finding his across the table, Ethan's arms settling around her shoulders as they watched Samuel play, small touches that built into something larger and more precious. They talked more openly now. Lydia spoke about James without the careful guardedness she'd maintained before, sharing memories with a mixture of fondness and grief. Ethan found he could talk about Martha too, about their brief marriage and the dreams they'd had, without feeling like he was betraying either woman by building a future with the other. "Do you think she'd understand?" Lydia asked one night, the question tentative. "Martha, about us." Ethan considered it carefully. "I think she'd want Samuel to have a mother, and I think she'd want me to be happy." He paused. "What about James?" "James always said life was for the living." Lydia's smile was bittersweet. "He wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my days alone out of loyalty to a ghost." "You're not alone anymore?" Ethan said. "No," Lydia agreed, her hand finding his. "I'm not." But the town's opinion remained divided. While some, like the Henshaws and young Henry Dobbs, had warmed to the Cole family, others held firm in their judgment, Mrs. Pruitt chief among them. The confrontation came on a market day in late May. Lydia was selecting vegetables at a farmer's stall, Samuel strapped to her chest in a sling she'd sewn, when Mrs. Pruitt approached with two other church ladies in tow. "Mrs. Cole?" she said, her voice carrying across the market square. "How convenient. We were just discussing you." Lydia straightened, her hand instinctively protective over Samuel's back. "Were you?" "Indeed. We've been thinking about the upcoming church social. Given the circumstances, we felt it best if you didn't attend." The market had gone quiet. Vendors paused their transactions. Customers turned to watch. Lydia felt heat crawl up her neck but kept her voice level. "What circumstances would those be?" "Your presence makes some of our members uncomfortable." Mrs. Pruitt's smile was poisonous. "We wouldn't want to cause unnecessary discord." "Unnecessary," Lydia repeated slowly. "You mean my existence causes discord?" "I mean your choices have consequences. Surely you understand that." "I understand that I saved a dying child when no one else would," Lydia said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "I understand that I've done nothing wrong except refuse to be ashamed of my life. If that makes people uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine why." "How dare you? How dare I what? Speak the truth?" Lydia stepped forward, fury finally breaking through her careful control. "You wanted me to disappear, to fade away after James and the baby died. Well, I didn't. I'm still here. And I have a family, now, whether you approve or not." Mrs. Pruitt's face flushed purple. "That child isn't yours." "He is mine," Lydia's voice rang clear and fierce. "In every way that matters. I fed him, cared for him, loved him. That makes him mine." "You're delusional." "Playing at motherhood with someone else's?" "Enough." The voice was male, authoritative. Ethan pushed through the crowd, his face thunderous. He'd been at the hardware store and had heard the commotion. "You don't get to speak to my wife that way." Mrs. Pruitt turned on him. "Your wife is unstable. Everyone knows it. The way she clings to that baby, as if loving him hard enough will bring back the one she killed." Ethan moved so fast several people gasped. He didn't touch Mrs. Pruitt, but he got close enough that she stumbled back, fear flashing across her face. "Say that again," he said softly, dangerously. "Accuse my wife of murder one more time and see what happens." "Ethan," Lydia's voice was tight. "Don't." But Ethan was past caring. "You've spread your poison for months, questioned our marriage, our fitness as parents, Lydia's sanity, all because we didn't bow to your judgment. He looked around at the assembled crowd. My son was dying. Everyone here knows it. You all had the chance to help, and you chose not to. Lydia opened her door when yours were locked, and for that, you've punished her every day since. We have standards, Mrs. Pruitt began. Your standards would have let a baby die. Ethan cut her off. So forgive me if I don't give a damn about your opinion of my family. He turned to Lydia, who stood frozen with tears streaming down her face. Come on, he said gently. Let's go home. Lydia nodded mutely. Ethan took her arm, guiding her through the crowd. Behind them, the market erupted in whispers, but he didn't look back. At home, Lydia's composure shattered completely. She handed Samuel to Ethan and sank onto the bed, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deep and wounded. She said I killed him, Lydia gasped between tears. She thinks that I did something. She's a bitter woman looking for someone to hurt, Ethan said, settling Samuel in his cradle before sitting beside her. Nothing she says is true. But what if people believe her? What if they think, then they're fools? Ethan pulled Lydia into his arms, holding her while she wept. Anyone who knows you knows the truth. Not many people know me, Lydia said bitterly. I know you. Ethan tipped her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. I know you're the strongest person I've ever met. I know you've survived losses that would break most people. I know you love Samuel with everything you have. And I know that you're good, Lydia. So damn good, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Fresh tears spilled over, but these seemed different, cleansing rather than despairing. Lydia pressed her face against Ethan's chest, her hands fisting in his shirt. I'm so tired of fighting. Then let me fight for you, Ethan said. You've carried this alone long enough. Let me help. You already do. More than. Whatever you need. Lydia lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, but holding something fierce and determined. I need to stop letting them have power over me. I need to stop caring what they think. Can you do that? I don't know. Lydia wiped her face roughly. But I want to try. Then we'll try together, Ethan said. Starting with that church social. We're going. Lydia's eyes widened. Ethan, we're going, he repeated firmly. As a family. And we're going to hold our heads high and dare anyone to say a word. They'll make a scene. Let them. We've survived worse. Lydia searched his face, looking for certainty or madness, maybe finding both. Finally, she nodded. All right, we'll go. The week leading up to the social was tense. Ethan heard whispers at the mercantile, bets on whether the Coles would actually show, speculation about what Mrs. Pruitt would do. Henshaw, to his credit, told the gossipers to mind their business or take it elsewhere. You sure about this? Henshaw asked Ethan privately. Constance Pruitt holds grudges. This could get ugly. It's already ugly, Ethan said. Might as well face it head on. The day of the social dawned clear and warm. Lydia dressed with meticulous care, choosing her best dress, deep blue with buttons Martha had given her years ago. She braided her hair and pinned it up, her hands shaking only slightly. Ethan wore his suit, the one he'd married Martha in, the one he'd married Lydia in. Samuel wore clothes Lydia had stayed up late finishing, tiny trousers and a shirt that made him look like a miniature gentleman. They walked to the church together, a united front. People were already gathered on the lawn, tables laden with food, children running between groups, the hum of conversation. Heads turned as the Coles approached. Conversations died. The silence spread like ripples in water. Mrs. Pruitt stood near the dessert table, her spine rigid with outrage. Pastor Michaels, looking uncomfortable, moved to intercept them. Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole, I wasn't expecting... We're members of this community, Ethan said evenly. We have as much right to be here as anyone. Of course. It's just... The pastor glanced at Mrs. Pruitt, then back. Perhaps it would be better to avoid potential conflict. The only conflict, Lydia said clearly, comes from people who've decided to make us targets. We've done nothing wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded agreement, others looked away. And then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Henshaw stepped forward. Lydia, she said, her voice carrying, I've been meaning to tell you that blanket you made for Samuel is beautiful. Would you consider making one for my daughter's baby? The offer hung in the air, significant in its normalcy. Lydia's eyes widened. Yes, of course. Wonderful. Mrs. Henshaw smiled, then turned to glare at Mrs. Pruitt. I think it's time we stopped listening to gossip and started seeing what's right in front of us. The Coles are a fine family. Anyone with eyes can see that. Another woman spoke up, Mrs. Fletcher, the baker's wife. My Tommy says Samuel is the happiest baby he's ever seen. Says Lydia talks to him real sweet when she's at the market. And Ethan's been nothing but helpful at the store, Henshaw added, joining his wife. Works hard, pays his debts. That's more than I can say for some. One by one, people stepped forward. Not everyone. A significant portion remained silent or actively hostile, but enough to matter. Enough to show the Coles they weren't entirely alone. Mrs. Pruitt's face had gone white with fury. This is absurd. You're condoning... We're acknowledging reality, Mrs. Henshaw interrupted. The Coles are married. They're raising a child. They're doing a fine job of it. Whatever opinions we had before don't matter now. Your opinions never mattered, Lydia said quietly, her voice shaking but determined. What mattered was Samuel, and he's thriving. We're thriving, despite everything you've done to tear us down. She looked around at the assembled crowd, at the people who'd rejected her, judged her, tried to destroy her. I know I'm not what you expected. I know I don't fit your idea of what a wife or mother should be, but I'm Samuel's mother. I'm Ethan's wife, and I'm not going anywhere. Ethan's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together. We're not going anywhere, he echoed. The silence that followed was different than before, not hostile, but contemplative. People were reconsidering, reassessing. Not all of them would change their minds, but some would. And that was enough. Mrs. Pruitt, seeing her influence crumbling, made one last desperate attempt. You can't rewrite history. We all know how this started, with you forcing us into marriage to avoid a scandal you manufactured, Ethan said flatly. Yes, we remember. Best decision we ever made, as it turns out. He turned to Lydia, pulling her close despite the public setting. I married you because I had to, but I'd choose you now because I want to. Every day. For the rest of my life. Lydia's breath caught. Around them the crowd reacted, some with approval, some with shock, some with disgust. But Ethan didn't care. He only cared about the way Lydia was looking at him, with wonder and love and the kind of trust that came from surviving hell together. I choose you too, she whispered. Mrs. Pruitt made a sound of profound disgust and stalked away, her remaining allies following. The tension broke like a fever. People returned to their conversations, though many kept glancing at the Coles with new curiosity. Mrs. Henshaw approached with a plate of cake. For what it's worth, she said quietly. I'm sorry for turning you away that night, for not helping. Ethan accepted the plate. You're helping now, that counts. The social continued around them. Some people remained distant, but others, tentatively, gradually, approached. Asking about Samuel, complimenting Lydia's dress, making small talk that felt like olive branches. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was something. A crack in the wall of judgment that had surrounded them since the beginning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the church lawn, Ethan and Lydia sat together on a blanket with Samuel between them. The baby was fascinated by grass, grabbing fistfuls and bringing them to his mouth, while his parents laughed and redirected his attention. We did it, Lydia said softly. We actually survived. More than survived, Ethan said. We're living. Lydia leaned against his shoulder, and Ethan wrapped his arm around her. Samuel made a happy gurgling sound, and they both looked down at him, this child who'd brought them together, who'd given them both a reason to fight when they'd had nothing left. Thank you, Lydia said suddenly. For what? For not giving up. On Samuel. On me. On us. Ethan kissed the top of her head. Never. You're stuck with me now. Good, Lydia said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Because I'm not letting go. They sat there as twilight deepened, a family built from loss and desperation and choice. Around them the town moved on, Some people still judging, others beginning to accept, most just trying to live their own complicated lives. But the Coles had each other, and Samuel, and a future they were building one day at a time, not perfect, not easy, but undeniably, irrevocably theirs. Summer arrived with a gentleness that felt like permission to hope. The house with the blue door, their home now, undeniably, filled with light, and the sound of Samuel's laughter as he discovered his own voice. At 5 months old, he was rolling over consistently, reaching for everything, responding to his name with bright-eyed recognition that made Lydia's heart turn over every single time. The town's hostility hadn't vanished entirely, but it had dulled to something more manageable. Mrs. Pruitt still crossed the street when she saw them coming, still gathered her diminishing circle of allies to whisper and judge. But the whispers had lost their teeth. Most people had moved on to newer scandals, fresher gossip. The Coles had become simply part of Ridgeway's fabric, unusual perhaps, but no longer actively threatening. Ethan had been promoted at the Mercantile, given responsibility for ordering and accounts. The extra money meant they could afford small luxuries, better cuts of meat, fabric for new clothes, a rattle for Samuel that he clutched with fierce possessiveness. Lydia had started taking in sewing again, her reputation for fine work spreading beyond the women who'd initially commissioned pieces just to have an excuse to inspect the Cole household up close. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, almost peaceful. But there was still one unresolved tension humming beneath the surface of their daily existence. The question of what their marriage actually was, now that it had become more than legal convenience. They'd kissed several times since that first impulsive collision outside the church. Gentle touches that spoke of affection and desire, and the slow unfurling of trust. But they still maintained careful distance, still slept in separate spaces. Ethan in the bed, Lydia in the chair or on a pallet on the floor, alternating as they'd agreed. The physical separation felt increasingly absurd given the emotional intimacy they'd developed, but neither quite knew how to bridge that final gap. It was Lydia who finally broke the stalemate on a warm evening in June. Samuel had gone down easily, worn out from a day of rolling and grabbing and general infant exploration. Ethan was at the table reviewing the Mercantile's inventory logs while Lydia mended one of his shirts, the domestic tableau so comfortable it hurt. "I've been thinking," Lydia said without looking up from her stitching. About how ridiculous this is." She gestured between them with her needle. "We're married. We have a child. We've told the entire town we're a real family, and yet we're still acting like strangers playing house." Ethan set down his pencil carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that bed is plenty big enough for 2 people. Lydia's cheeks colored, but her voice remained steady. "I'm saying I'm tired of pretending I don't want to fall asleep beside you. I'm saying—" She finally looked up, meeting his eyes with naked vulnerability. "I'm saying I want this to be real. Completely real. If you do." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. "Lydia, I know it's fast by normal standards," she rushed on. "I know we both still carry grief, but I also know that I love you. I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first night when you stood on my porch and refused to leave. Maybe when you defended me against Mrs. Pruitt. Maybe it's been building all along. But I do. Love you. And I'm tired of being afraid of it." The words hung in the air between them, brave and terrifying. Ethan stood, crossing the small space to kneel beside her chair. He took the mending from her hands, setting it aside, then captured her fingers in his. "I love you too," he said, the admission both relief and revelation. "I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself it was too soon or too complicated, or that I was betraying Martha's memory. But the truth is, you're not a betrayal. He struggled for the right words. "You're the reason I remember how to be alive instead of just surviving." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd never feel this again. After James, after the baby, I thought I was done, that I'd used up all my chances at happiness." "You haven't," Ethan said fiercely. "We both get another chance. We've earned it." Lydia cupped his face in her hands, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm still scared." "So am I. But I'm more scared of wasting this, of letting fear rob us of something good just because we've both known loss." "What if we lose each other?" The question was barely a whisper. "What if we don't?" Ethan countered. "What if we get years together? What if Samuel grows up watching his parents love each other, really love each other, and learns what a real marriage looks like? Fresh tears spilled over, but Lydia was smiling through them. When did you become such an optimist? When I met a woman brave enough to open her door in a blizzard. Ethan stood, drawing her up with him. When I watched her fight for a child who wasn't hers. When I realized I'd been given something precious and I'd be a fool to waste it. Lydia kissed him then, not desperate or questioning, but certain, a promise sealed with the press of her mouth against his. Ethan pulled her close, his hands spanning her waist, and kissed her back with everything he'd been holding in check for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia rested her forehead against his. "Stay with me tonight," she said quietly. "Really stay. Not just in the same house, but—" "I know what you mean," Ethan said, his voice rough. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They moved to the bed together, shy despite their declarations, fumbling with buttons and laces in the lamplight. But once they lay down together, skin against skin, hearts beating in synchrony, the awkwardness dissolved into something tender and inevitable. Ethan traced the lines of grief and survival written on Lydia's body, and she mapped the scars loss had left on his. And together they created something new from the wreckage of everything they'd endured. Afterward, lying tangled together in the summer heat with Samuel's soft breathing the only sound, Lydia pressed her face against Ethan's chest and whispered, "I was so alone before you. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be chosen." "You'll never be alone again," Ethan promised, his arms tightening around her. "I'm choosing you, every day for the rest of my life. I'm choosing you." Lydia tilted her head up, kissing him softly. "And I'm choosing you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, their dreams were peaceful. The next weeks unfolded with a sweetness that felt almost dangerous in its intensity. Ethan and Lydia stopped pretending their marriage was anything other than real, and the change was visible to anyone paying attention. They touched freely now, hands clasped while walking through town, Ethan's arm around Lydia's waist while she shopped, stolen kisses when Samuel napped. The shift didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Henshaw commented on how happy they looked. Henry Dobbs grinned knowingly when he delivered their mail. Even Pastor Michaels, who'd performed their reluctant wedding, remarked that he was glad to see the union taking on a more traditional character. "Traditional," Lydia repeated that evening, amused, as if anything about us is traditional. "We're married, raising a child, making a home," Ethan pointed out. "That's about as traditional as it gets. Except for the part where we started as a business arrangement forced on us by a vindictive town council." Details. Ethan pulled her into his lap, making her laugh. Samuel, playing on a blanket nearby, made a sound of protest at being ignored. "Sorry, Samuel, your mother's monopolizing my attention." "Your mother," Lydia repeated softly, wonder in her voice. She still sometimes seemed surprised by the title, as if expecting someone to revoke it. "Our mother," Ethan corrected, seeing her expression. "In every way that counts." Lydia's eyes shone. She slid off his lap to scoop up Samuel, holding him close. The baby grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked, making her wince and laugh simultaneously. "Gentle, sweetheart. Mama needs that." The word came so naturally now. Mama. Samuel had started babbling, not quite words, but definitely communicating, and Lydia swore he was trying to say her name. Ethan suspected she was right. The baby lit up whenever Lydia entered the room, tracking her with his eyes, reaching for her with determined little hands. "He knows who his people are," Ethan observed. "Smart boy," Lydia said, kissing Samuel's head. "Takes after his father." The compliment, casual as it was, still made Ethan's chest tight. He'd spent so long defined by loss and failure, the husband who couldn't save his wife, the father whose son had nearly died, the man the town had rejected. But Lydia saw him differently, as capable, strong, worth choosing. He was learning to see himself through her eyes, and the reflection was kinder than anything he'd managed alone. But their peace was shattered on a scorching afternoon in late July when Henry Dobbs came running to the Mercantile, his face pale beneath the film of sweat. "Mr. Cole," he gasped, "you need to come. There's been an accident." Ethan's blood turned to ice. What kind of accident? Where's Lydia? She's fine. She wasn't hurt. But there's a fire. The old Peterson barn caught, and it's spreading toward your place. Ethan didn't wait for more details. He ran. Smoke was visible before he even reached Maple Street, a black column rising against the blue summer sky. The Peterson property bordered their own, separated by maybe 100 yards of scrub grass that was now, thanks to the drought, dry as kindling. Lydia stood in their yard. Samuel clutched against her chest, staring at the approaching flames. Several neighbors had formed a bucket brigade from the well, but Ethan could see immediately it wasn't going to be enough. The fire was moving too fast, driven by wind and feeding on months of rainless heat. Lydia! He reached her, hands on her shoulders. Are you all right? It started in the barn, she said, her voice eerily calm. Lightning strike, they think. It spread before anyone could stop it. We need to evacuate. Get what we can and go. Go where? Lydia looked at him, and Ethan saw the truth in her eyes. This house, the blue door, the rooms where they'd built their marriage, the only real home either of them had known in years, was about to burn. My cabin, Ethan said. It's far enough away, it should be safe. Come on. They worked frantically, grabbing what they could, clothes, documents, the quilt Martha had made, Samuel's things. Lydia snatched her sewing kit and the letters James had written during their courtship. Ethan took his father's pocket watch and the marriage certificate that had once felt like a prison sentence and now represented everything worth saving. The fire kept coming. Other houses were being evacuated too, the Millers, the Fosters, anyone in the potential path of destruction. The bucket brigade had given up trying to stop the fire and focused instead on creating fire breaks, digging trenches, and wetting down roofs. Ethan and Lydia stood in the street, their belongings piled at their feet, watching smoke pour from the Peterson barn. The fire hadn't reached their house yet, but the wind was shifting, carrying embers that landed sizzling on the dry grass. We should go, Ethan said. It's not safe here. But Lydia didn't move. She stared at the blue door, faded and weathered, the paint peeling in places, but hers, theirs. That house saved my life, she said quietly. After James died, after I lost the baby, I wanted to die too. But I had the house, something to maintain, a reason to get up every morning. And then you came, and it became something more. It became home, Ethan finished. Yes, Lydia's voice cracked, and now we might lose it. Ethan set down Samuel's basket and pulled Lydia into his arms. The house is just wood and nails. What matters is us, you, me, Samuel. As long as we have each other, we have home. Lydia clung to him, her face pressed against his chest. Behind them, someone shouted. The fire had jumped a firebreak and was racing toward the row of houses that included theirs. Men scrambled with buckets and blankets. Women herded children to safety. And Ethan, making a split-second decision, shoved their belongings at Lydia and ran toward the house. Ethan, no! But he was already moving. There was one thing he hadn't grabbed, one thing he couldn't leave behind. He burst through the blue door into smoke-hazed air and ran to the bedroom. There, wrapped carefully in tissue paper and stored in the trunk, was the christening gown Lydia had been sewing for Samuel. She'd worked on it for weeks, embroidering his name and the date with meticulous care, pouring love into every stitch. Ethan grabbed it and ran back outside just as flames reached the house. The dry wood caught instantly, fire racing up the walls with terrifying speed. He stumbled into the street, coughing, his eyes streaming, and Lydia was there, snatching the gown from his hands before checking him frantically for injuries. You idiot, she sobbed. You could have died? Couldn't let it burn, Ethan rasped, his throat raw from smoke. You worked too hard on it. Lydia made a sound between a laugh and a sob, crushing the gown to her chest. Behind them, the house was fully engulfed, flames pouring from the windows, the blue door blackening and warping in the heat. They stood together, Ethan, Lydia, and Samuel, and watched their home burn. Other houses caught too. The Millers, the Fosters. The fire consumed everything in its path with indiscriminate hunger, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch and pray it didn't spread further. It took until evening for the fire to burn itself out, running up against the creek that marked the eastern edge of town and finally dying for lack of fuel. 6 houses gone. 2 barns. The Peterson property reduced to ash and charred timbers. The coal house with the blue door was nothing but a smoking foundation. Ethan and Lydia sat on the steps of the mercantile, Samuel asleep in Lydia's arms, and stared at the destruction. They had what they'd managed to grab: a few clothes, some documents, treasured objects, but everything else was gone. The bed where they'd finally admitted they loved each other, the table where they'd shared meals and built a life, the rocking chair where Lydia had nursed Samuel through countless nights. "We'll rebuild," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Lydia didn't answer. She just held Samuel tighter and stared at the ruins with hollow eyes. Mr. Henshaw emerged from the mercantile, his face grim. "You can stay at our place tonight. We've got room." "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. But before they could move, a commotion erupted down the street. Mrs. Pruitt's voice, shrill and furious, cut through the evening air. "This is judgment, divine judgment on those who mock righteousness." Ethan's head snapped up. Mrs. Pruitt stood in the middle of the street, flanked by her remaining supporters, pointing at the ruins with righteous fury. "The Coles brought this upon us with their sinful arrangement. This is what happens when we tolerate immorality in our midst." Something in Ethan snapped. He stood, moving toward Mrs. Pruitt with deliberate purpose. Lydia called after him, but he didn't stop. "You think this is judgment?" His voice was quiet, but carried. 6 families lost their homes. Children are crying. People are hurt. And you think that's divine punishment for my marriage? Mrs. Pruitt lifted her chin. "The righteous are tested. The wicked are destroyed." "The wicked?" Ethan laughed, a sound without humor. "My wife saved a dying baby when everyone else turned their backs. She's fed him, raised him, loved him. If that's wickedness, then I'll take it over your righteousness any day." A crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Mrs. Pruitt looked around, sensing her audience. "You married her out of lust and desperation, not love. Everyone knows it. This sham, Lydia's voice cut through, clear and strong, has become the most real thing in my life." She'd stood, Samuel in her arms, and moved to stand beside Ethan. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her spine was straight. "You're right that we didn't marry for love," she continued. "We married because you forced us to. But what we built after, that was ours. We chose each other. Every day we chose each other, and now our home is gone. Everything we built is ashes, and you stand here calling it judgment?" Lydia's voice broke, but she pushed on. "If there's any judgment here, it's on a town that would rather punish compassion than celebrate it, that would rather destroy people who don't fit their mold than acknowledge that maybe, there's more than one way to build a family." Mrs. Henshaw stepped forward from the crowd. "Lydia's right. We've treated the Coles shamefully. They've done nothing but try to survive and care for that baby, and we've made it as hard as possible." Others murmured agreement. Not everyone. Mrs. Pruitt still had her adherents, but enough to matter. Pastor Michaels, who'd been helping with the bucket brigade, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Pruitt, I think perhaps your zeal has led you astray. The fire was an accident. Lightning and dry grass. Nothing more." "But nothing more," the pastor repeated firmly. "And I think we owe the Coles an apology. Several apologies, in fact." Mrs. Pruitt's face went purple. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and stalked away, her remaining supporters trailing behind. The crowd began to disperse, but several people approached the Coles, offering condolences, help, spare rooms for the night. The Henshaws insisted they stay as long as needed. Mrs. Fletcher promised food. Henry Dobbs volunteered to help with rebuilding. Small gestures, but they added up to something larger: acceptance. Finally, fully, without reservation. That night, sleeping in the Henshaws' spare room with Samuel between them, Lydia whispered, "We've lost everything." "Not everything," Ethan said. "We still have each other." "Is that enough?" Ethan thought about the house, about Martha buried in the church cemetery, about James and the baby Lydia had lost, about all the grief they'd carried. Then he looked at Samuel, sleeping peacefully, and at Lydia, exhausted but alive beside him. "Yes," he said, "it's enough." The rebuilding took months. The town came together in a way Ethan hadn't thought possible. Neighbors helping neighbors clear debris and lay new foundations. The Coles house went up alongside the others, everyone working together in rotation. But this house was different, larger, with a real bedroom and a separate space for Samuel, built with lumber that Henshaw sold them at cost, and nails donated by the hardware store. Everyone contributed something: time, materials, expertise, and when it was finally finished, as autumn painted the mountains golden red, Lydia stood in the new kitchen and cried. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, alarmed. "Nothing's wrong." Lydia wiped her eyes, laughing. I never thought I'd have this. A real home, a family, people who cared." Ethan pulled her close. Samuel, now crawling and getting into everything, pulled himself up using Ethan's leg and demanded attention with a babbled, "Mama!" Lydia scooped him up, pressing kisses to his face while he giggled. "Yes, baby, Mama's here. Mama and Papa both." "Papa." The word still made Ethan's throat tight. He'd been Papa for months now, but hearing Samuel say it, or try to say it, the consonant still mushy, never got old. That evening, they hosted a small gathering to thank everyone who'd helped. The house filled with people, with laughter and conversation and the smell of Lydia's cooking. Mrs. Henshaw brought pie. Henry Dobbs brought flowers. Even Pastor Michaels stopped by with a blessing for their new home. As the sun set and guests began to leave, Ethan and Lydia stood on their new porch, painted blue at Lydia's insistence, and watched the town settle into evening routines. "We made it," Lydia said softly. "Against everything. We made it." "We did," Ethan agreed, his arm around her waist. "Do you ever think about how it started, that first night when you knocked on my door?" "All the time." "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Ethan turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. "Not a single moment. Everything we've been through, the judgment, the fire, all of it, led us here, to this. And I wouldn't change it." Lydia's eyes shone. "I love you. I love you too." Ethan kissed her softly. "You and Samuel both. My family." Inside, Samuel began to fuss, and they turned together to tend to him. Their son, their home, their life built from wreckage and desperation, and the simple, powerful choice to keep trying. The blue door closed behind them, and through the window, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming, a beacon that said here lived people who'd survived the worst and chosen love anyway, who'd built family from the ashes of loss, who'd refused to let judgment and cruelty define them. The town of Ridgeway would remember the winter of 1877, when a rancher's wife died and a baby nearly followed. They'd remember the widow who opened her door when everyone else locked theirs. They'd remember the unconventional marriage that scandalized the church ladies and the fire that nearly destroyed them all. But mostly, they'd remember that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the hardest soil, that families come in all shapes, built through biology or choice or desperate necessity that transforms into something real, that love doesn't follow rules or timelines, doesn't wait for permission or perfect circumstances. And they'd remember the house with the blue door and the family inside who proved that second chances aren't just possible, they're worth fighting for. Years later, Samuel would ask his mother how she and his father fell in love. Lydia would smile, exchange a glance with Ethan, and say, "He knocked on my door in a blizzard and refused to leave until I helped him. I was too stubborn to say no, and he was too desperate to give up. And somehow, that became everything." "That's not very romantic," Samuel would complain. "No," Ethan would agree, pulling both of them close. "But it's true. And sometimes truth is better than romance." Lydia would kiss her husband, then her son, and think about the girl she'd been, alone and grieving and certain she'd never matter to anyone again. She'd think about the blue door she'd almost not opened, the choice that had changed everything. Sometimes, she'd say to Samuel, "The best things in life start with a knock on the door and the courage to answer it. Remember that." And Samuel would, carrying that lesson forward into his own life, into his own choices, into the family he'd eventually build. But that was still years away. For now, in the autumn of 1877, the Cole family sat together in their new house with the blue door, and they were happy. Not because everything was perfect or easy, not because the town had fully forgiven them or the past had stopped hurting, but because they'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other through every storm and fire and judgment. And that was enough.